On a wide chalk plain in southern England, there is a ring of enormous stones. Some of them weigh as much as 4 loaded lorries. They were dragged there, stood upright, and capped with a continuous ring of lintels by people who had no metal, no wheel, no riding, and no draft animals strong enough to help. They finished the work about 4,500 years ago, and then they left no explanation of any kind. Let the room grow quiet around you now, and let the light go low, and let me tell you the whole story of Stonehenge. It is the most famous ancient monument in the world, and it is also, in a very literal sense, the least understood. We know almost exactly how it was built. We know roughly when each part went up. We know where the stones came from, who ate what beside them, and where those people were born. What nobody can tell you, nobody after 4 centuries of digging and arguing, is what it was for. Start with the part that should not be possible. The smaller stones in the middle, the ones called Bluestones, are not local. They come from a specific group of rocky outcrops in the Preseli Hills in West Wales, about 240 kilometers away in a straight line, and considerably further by any route a human being could actually take. There are around 80 of them. Each weighs a couple of tons. The great stones, the Sarsens, the ones that make the shape everybody recognizes, came from much closer, about 25 kilometers north, from a wood on the Marlborough Downs. That sounds easier until you weigh them. The largest standing sarsen is over 9 meters long and weighs somewhere around 30 tons. It was moved by people pulling on ropes. And they were not simply stood up and left. The lintels across the top are held in place by joints borrowed from woodworking. Each upright has a knob carved on its crown. Each lintel has a hollow cut in its underside to receive it. The lintels lock into one another end to end with a tongue and groove. Somebody worked stone as though it were timber, 30 tons at a time, 5 meters in the air. The whole structure is aimed at the sun. Stand in the middle on the morning of the summer solstice and the sun rises along the axis. Stand in the same place on the afternoon of the midwinter solstice and it sets along the same line in the opposite direction. Whichever of those two mattered more to the builders, and there is a good case that it was the winter one, the alignment is deliberate and it is accurate. Long before any of the great stones arrived, the site was something else entirely. Around 3000 BC, 500 years earlier, people dug a circular ditch there with antler picks, threw the chalk up into a bank, and began burying their dead inside it. Cremated bone, scattered in pits around the inner edge. For centuries, Stonehenge was a graveyard. 2 miles away, on the bank of the river, archaeologists found the village of the people who built it. Hundreds of small houses, floors still showing where the hearths and the beds had been, and refuse heaps packed with the bones of pigs and cattle. It seems to have stood for only a few decades, long enough to raise the stones and no longer. The animals in those refuse heaps had been brought from all over Britain. The chemistry locked into their teeth records the water they drank as they grew, and it points to Wales, to Scotland, to the West Country. People walked hundreds of miles, driving cattle in front of them, to eat one enormous midwinter meal beside a circle of stones, and then walked home again. They left no writing because writing did not exist in Britain and would not for another 2,500 years. Everything we have is physical: holes, chippings, bone, teeth, charcoal, and the stones themselves. Every sentence anybody says about why Stonehenge was built is an inference drawn from rubbish and geometry. By the time the Romans arrived, Stonehenge was already older to them than the Roman invasion is to us. They visited it, dropped pottery and coins around it, and appear to have had no better idea than we do. Whatever the monument had meant, the meaning had already been gone for 2,000 years. The Middle Ages filled the gap with a story. Merlin the enchanter, it was said, brought the stones by magic from Ireland, where giants had originally carried them from Africa, and set them up on Salisbury Plain as a memorial to the murdered British nobles. That account was written down in the 12th century and taken seriously for a very long time. Then, in the 17th and 18th centuries, antiquarians decided that Stonehenge had been built by the Druids. It is the single most durable wrong idea in British archaeology. The Druids were Iron Age priests. They arrived on the scene roughly 2,000 years after the last stone at Stonehenge was raised. They had nothing to do with it whatsoever. There is one more thing to know before we begin, and it surprises most people. A great deal of what you see today was put back up in the 20th century. Stones that had fallen were straightened, reset, and in many cases anchored in concrete between 1901 and 1964. The famous silhouette is genuine ancient stone in a partly modern arrangement. So this is a story with a very solid middle and no ending. We can follow the quarrying, the hauling, the raising, the feasting, and the burials in remarkable detail. And then, at the moment where the purpose should be, there is a gap that all the evidence in the world has not yet filled. Tonight I am going to walk you through the whole of it, slowly, from the pine posts that were standing on that plain before farming even reached Britain, to the ring of stones under the rain today. There is no need to hold on to any of it. So dim the lights, close your eyes, and let the plain go quiet. Let us begin with the thing itself, because most people have a picture in their heads that is not quite right. Stonehenge is not a single circle. It is several structures built in different centuries, sitting one inside another, and about half of it is missing. What survives is a ruin of a ruin, and the shape you recognize is only the largest and most obvious part of it. The outermost element is the earthwork, a circular ditch with a bank inside it, about 100 meters across. It is shallow now, worn down by 5,000 years of weather and plowing, and most visitors walk straight over it without noticing. But it is the oldest part of the monument, and it defines the boundary of everything else. Inside that, the famous ring. 30 upright Sarsens stones, each around 4 meters tall above ground, set in a circle roughly 30 meters in diameter, and topped by 30 curved lintels forming a continuous stone hoop. That is what was built. Today, 17 of the uprights are still standing and 6 lintels remain in place. The rest lie broken on the grass or are gone entirely. The missing ones did not vanish mysteriously. Over the centuries, stone was taken away to mend roads, build barns and repair walls, and pieces were broken off by visitors with hammers, which were once rented out on site for exactly that purpose. Within the ring stood 5 enormous freestanding structures called trilithons, 2 uprights carrying a single lintel, arranged in a horseshoe that opens toward the midsummer sunrise. They were graded in height, the smallest at the ends and the tallest at the closed end of the horseshoe. That tallest one, the Great Trilithon, rose over 7 meters. One of its uprights fell in 1797 and one still stands, leaning. Standing beneath the surviving upright of the Great Trilithon is the moment most visitors go quiet. It is not the width of the circle that impresses. It is the sheer vertical mass of a single dressed block leaning above you with nothing holding it but its own weight in a hole. Threaded through both of those, and much easier to miss, are the Bluestones, smaller, darker, rougher, some of them barely chest-high. There was a bluestone circle between the Sarsen ring and the horseshoe, and a bluestone oval inside the horseshoe. They were moved around repeatedly. In the sequence of construction, they are the most rearranged elements on the site. Then there is the altar stone. It lies flat on the ground near the center, half buried under a fallen trilithon upright, and for 2 centuries it was assumed to be Welsh like the other Bluestones. In 2024, a chemical study of its mineral grains matched it instead to northeast Scotland, a journey of at least 750 kilometers. Nobody has explained that yet. That result was not a minor adjustment. It means at least one stone at Stonehenge was carried from what is now Aberdeenshire across the whole length of Britain by people who had no reason to do it that we can name. Outside the ring, a single stone stands alone in the field to the northeast, leaning at an angle. It is called the heel stone. It is unshaped, and it sits beside the avenue that runs away from the monument. Viewed from the center at midsummer, the sun comes up near it. There was almost certainly a second stone beside it once, forming a gap for the sun to rise through. For more stones, called the station stones, were set just inside the bank at the corners of a rectangle. To survive, both fallen. That rectangle is quietly remarkable. Its short sides point at the solstice sunrise and sunset, and its long sides point at the extreme rising and setting positions of the moon. The geometry only works at this latitude, which means the position of the whole monument was chosen. It also tells us something quietly humbling about the builders. Somebody had watched the sun and the moon carefully enough over years to know where their extremes fell, and then chose a place on the map where those 2 sets of extremes made a clean right angle. Running away from the entrance is the avenue, 2 parallel banks and ditches about 12 meters apart, which leave the monument along the solstice axis, run straight for about 500 meters, then swing east and eventually curve down to the River Avon nearly 3 kilometers away. It is a road built for arriving on foot, and it approaches the stones from the correct direction. Scattered across the surrounding plain are hundreds of burial mounds, most of them raised centuries after the stones went up, by people who wanted to be buried in sight of the monument. From the air, the landscape around Stonehenge is not empty at all. It is one of the most densely built ceremonial landscapes anywhere in prehistoric Europe. Some of those mounds were still being raised more than 1,000 years after the last stone was set. People kept wanting to be buried within sight of it long after they had stopped using it. So when you picture Stonehenge, do not picture an isolated ring on a bare plain. Picture a walled enclosure containing several concentric settings of stone, standing at the head of a processional road that runs to a river, in the middle of a landscape crowded with monuments and graves, all of it built and rebuilt over a period of roughly 1,500 years. The story does not begin with farmers, and it does not begin with stone. It begins about 10,000 years ago, in a Britain that had only recently stopped being part of the European mainland, among people who did not farm at all. And it begins with something that was found by accident in the 1960s when a car park was being dug for tourists. 300 meters from the stones, the diggers hit a line of enormous pits. Each one had held a pine post nearly a meter thick, sunk deep into the chalk. There were at least 4 of them, spaced along a line running roughly east to west. Radiocarbon dating put them between about 8,500 and 700 BC, 5,000 years older than the stones they stand beside. The pits were substantial, some more than 1.5 meters deep, cut into solid chalk with antler and bone, and packed around with rubble to hold the posts steady. This was not a casual act. Somebody had decided those trees belonged there. That date matters enormously. In 800 BC, there was no farming in Britain, no pottery, no permanent villages, no domesticated animals except the dog. Britain was covered in dense wildwood and populated by small mobile bands of hunter-gatherers. And somewhere in that world, a group of those people cut down for huge pines, dragged them to this particular spot, and stood them up. We have no idea why. Totem poles is the usual guess on the analogy of the Pacific Northwest, but it is only a guess. What the posts prove is not their purpose but their location. Something about that patch of chalk downland was already significant to people thousands of years before anyone thought of moving a stone there. It is worth saying plainly that a gap of 5,000 years is enormous. The posts and the stones are separated by more time than separates us from the pyramids. Whatever continuity existed between them was carried entirely by memory and story. There may be a reason, and it is a strange one. Running across the ground on the solstice axis, exactly where the avenue was later built, there are natural ridges in the chalk, periglacial stripes, cut by freeze and thaw at the end of the Ice Age. They happen by pure geological accident to run in the direction of the midsummer sunrise. If people walking that landscape noticed that the ground itself was grooved along the line the sun rose on, then the site was not chosen by astronomers surveying an empty plain. It was chosen because it already looked as though the earth and the sky agreed with each other there. That is speculation, but it is speculation with stripes of chalk under it. Archaeologists are properly cautious about this because it is the kind of idea that is very attractive and very hard to test. But the stripes are genuinely there, they genuinely run on the solstice line, and the avenue was genuinely built along them. By around 4000 BC, everything had changed. Farming arrived in Britain, brought, we now know from ancient DNA, by people migrating from the continent whose ancestry traces back through Iberia to the first farmers of Anatolia. They came with wheat and barley, cattle, sheep, pigs, and pottery, and within a few centuries the hunter-gatherer population had almost entirely disappeared from the genetic record. These new farmers cleared the wildwood, and they built in earth and timber on a scale nobody in Britain had attempted before. Long barrows, great earthen mounds containing the bones of the dead, appeared across the chalk. Causewayed enclosures, rings of interrupted ditch, appeared on hilltops. The dead were becoming architecture. The scale of that building is easy to underestimate. A single long barrow could take tens of thousands of hours of digging with antler and basket. Britain in the 4th millennium BC was already a place where communities routinely undertook projects longer than one working life. Around Stonehenge specifically, this phase left something enormous and almost completely overlooked. The Greater Cursus is a rectangular earthwork nearly 3 kilometers long and about 150 meters wide, running east to west across the plain just north of where the stones would later stand. It was built around 3500 BC. Nobody knows what it was for either. To build it, people dug 2 parallel ditches nearly 3 kilometers long by hand. Nothing was found inside it. No burials, no buildings, no occupation. It appears to have been a shape drawn on the land for its own sake. So by the time the first ditch was dug at Stonehenge, the plain was not blank. It held a memory of pine posts, a natural alignment in the chalk, tombs of the ancestors, and a 3-kilometer earthwork of unknown purpose. The people who began the monument were building inside a landscape that already had 1,000 years of meaning attached to it. Around 3000 BC, give or take a century, people came to that spot and began to dig. They had no metal. What they had were the shed antlers of red deer, collected from the woods, used as picks to lever out the chalk, and the shoulder blades of cattle used as shovels. Some of those antler picks were left in the ditch and are still in museums, worn down at the tip. The ditch they cut was not a neat trench. It was a series of connected pits, dug at slightly different depths and angles, as though separate work gangs had each been given a length to complete. It runs in a circle about 110 meters across, and the chalk they took out was piled into a bank on the inside, which is unusual because most enclosures put the bank outside. The unevenness is one of the most human things on the site. You can see where one gang cut deep and square and another gave up early and left a shallow scoop, and the two lengths do not quite meet in the middle. A bank on the inside is not a defense. You cannot see out over it easily, and it gives no advantage against an attacker. What an internal bank does is screen the interior from people standing outside. Whatever happened inside that ring at this earliest stage was not meant to be watched by everybody. There were two entrances, one to the northeast and a smaller one to the south. The northeastern gap is the important one. It faces the midsummer sunrise, and it is the same axis that the entire monument would still be using 1,500 years later. From the very first cut in the chalk, the alignment was already there. That is worth pausing on. The orientation of Stonehenge was not an addition or a later refinement or a happy accident of the stone settings. It was the first decision anybody made about the place, and it never changed. Just inside the bank, they dug a ring of 56 pits, evenly spaced around the whole circumference. They are known as the Aubrey Holes, after the 17th century antiquary who first noticed dimples in the turf. Each one is about 1 meter across and 1 meter deep, with a flat bottom, cut cleanly into the chalk. What went into those pits has been argued about for a century. The excavator who dug some of them in the 1920s thought they had held timber posts. Later work found crushing and compaction at the bottom consistent with something heavy and stones standing in them, then being removed. If that is right, the very first stones at Stonehenge went up at the same time as the ditch. The argument matters because it changes the story. If stones stood in the Aubrey Holes from the beginning, then Stonehenge was a stone monument 500 years earlier than the textbook version, and the Bluestones arrived far sooner after being quarried. And what is certain is what was put into them afterwards. Cremated human bone. Not a token deposit, the remains of perhaps 150 individuals, burned, gathered up and placed in the Aubrey Holes and in the ditch and bank around them. It is one of the largest Neolithic cremation cemeteries known in Britain. Analysis of that burnt bone has shown men, women, and children, adults of a range of ages, deposited over a period of about 500 years. Whoever they were not one social class or one sex or one age group. And a chemical study of the skull fragments found that a substantial proportion of them had not grown up on Salisbury Plain at all. Some of them came from West Wales. The isotope work behind that conclusion is delicate. Cremation burns away most of what archaeologists usually test, but strontium survives in the mineral structure of burnt bone, and it records the geology of the place where that person spent their last decade or so. That is a startling thing to sit with. The same region the Bluestones came from was also, apparently, sending its dead. The evidence does not prove that the bones and the stones traveled together, and careful archaeologists say so. But it does mean that for centuries before the great Sarsens arrived, this place had a real connection with a specific part of Wales. What we can say is that Stonehenge was never a purely local affair. From its earliest phase, people and materials were arriving from a long way off, in a country where a journey of 200 miles meant weeks of walking through forest. So the first Stonehenge was a circular enclosure, screened from outside view, aligned on the summer sunrise, ringed with 56 pits, and used for the burial of cremated human remains for something like 20 generations. Not a temple in any sense we would recognize. A cemetery with a very particular relationship to the sky. Now we come to the part that no other prehistoric monument in Europe can match, and it is worth being clear about how odd it is. Everywhere else in the Neolithic world, when people built in stone, they used the stone that was lying nearby. At Stonehenge, somebody decided to import. The Bluestones are not one rock type. There are about 43 still on site and probably 80 originally, and they include spotted dolerite, unspotted dolerite, rhyolite, various volcanic ashes, and some sandstones. They are called bluestones because the dolerite looks bluish when wet or freshly broken. They are unremarkable to look at. They are, on the face of it, not worth carrying anywhere. Stand next to one today and the effect is almost anticlimactic. They are gray-green, weathered, often no taller than a person, and if you found one in a field you would step over it without a second glance. In 1923, a geologist named Herbert Thomas identified the source of the spotted dolerite. It came, he said, from the Preseli Hills in Pembrokeshire, in the far southwest of Wales. Since then, the sourcing has been narrowed with extraordinary precision. Individual outcrops have been matched to individual stones by their chemical fingerprint. 2 of those outcrops have now been excavated. Carn Godog, a ridge of spotted dolerite, and Craig Rose Wyphelin, a rhyolite crag in a wooded valley. At both sites, archaeologists found exactly what a Neolithic quarry should look like. Wedges of stone driven into natural vertical joints, artificial platforms built to receive a pillar as it came away, and stone hammers left behind. The excavators also found something rather moving at Craig Rose Wyphelin. A hearth, and beside it the remains of meals, in a hollow beneath the crag where a small group had evidently camped while they worked at getting a single pillar free. The geology did most of the work. Preseli dolerite forms naturally in tall vertical columns, already roughly pillar-shaped, standing shoulder to shoulder in the outcrop. You do not have to cut a monolith out of solid rock. You have to persuade one column to separate from its neighbors, and then lower it onto a platform. That is difficult, but it is not impossible with wooden wedges and patience. That is why these particular hills were chosen out of all the rock in Britain. It was not the color or the hardness or any special property of the stone. It was that the mountain came pre-cut into pillars. Charcoal and burnt hazelnut shells from the quarry floors gave dates. Craig Rose Wyphelin was being worked around 3400 to 3200 BC. Carn Godog around 3300 BC. And here is the difficulty. Those dates are 2 or 3 centuries earlier than the Bluestones appear at Stonehenge. The stones were quarried, and then something happened before they arrived. There is no polite way around that gap. Either the dating at one end is wrong, or the stones spent 200 or 300 years somewhere else before anyone thought of taking them to England. The leading explanation is that they were used somewhere else first. About 5 kilometers from the quarries, at a place called Wan Mon, there is the remains of a stone circle. Only 4 stones survive, but the empty sockets show it was once much larger, and it has a diameter of about 110 meters, the same as the ditch at Stonehenge. More than that, one of the empty sockets at Wan Mon is an unusual shape, a distinctive pentagonal cross-section, and one of the Bluestones at Stonehenge has a base that fits it. The Wan Mon circle also has an entrance aligned on the midsummer sunrise. The suggestion is that a Welsh monument was dismantled and rebuilt in England. The excavation also showed that Wan Mon had been deliberately emptied rather than abandoned. Sockets were left open, and there was no sign of the stones having been broken up on site. Whatever stood there was taken away whole. That interpretation has been challenged hard, and it should be. Critics point out that Wan Mon was probably never completed, that the dating is thin, and that a matching socket is a long way from proof. It remains a hypothesis. But it is a hypothesis that would explain the gap in the dates, and it fits the Welsh bones in the Aubrey holes uncomfortably well. There is a rival explanation that removes the human effort entirely, that glaciers carried the Preseli rocks eastward during an ice age and dumped them on Salisbury Plain, where the builders simply picked them up. It was seriously argued for decades. The trouble is that no glacial deposit containing Preseli stone has ever been found anywhere near Wiltshire, and the ice sheets do not appear to have gone that way. There is also a simpler objection. If glacial boulders of Preseli rock were lying around Salisbury Plain, we would expect to find them in other monuments, in field walls, in the plough soil. We find them only at Stonehenge and in its immediate landscape. The evidence taken together points to people. Somebody in West Wales quarried around 80 pillars of stone. Somebody moved them 240 kilometers. And whatever the reason was, it was strong enough that a community would spend years of its life doing it, in a world where every day's labor came out of the food supply. So how do you move a 2-ton pillar across a country with no roads, no wheels, no horses, and no metal? The honest answer is that we do not know which method they used. What we do know, because people have tested it repeatedly, is that several of the possible methods work. The sea route was the traditional favorite. Take the stones down to the coast of Pembrokeshire, load them onto rafts, and float them along the South Wales coast, across the Bristol Channel, up the Bristol Avon, overland across the last stretch, and down to Salisbury Plain. It is a lovely idea, and it has one large problem. That stretch of coast is among the most dangerous in Britain. Look at a map and you can see why the idea took hold. Preseli comes down almost to the sea, the Bristol Channel points straight at Wiltshire, and rivers run inland from it. On paper, the water does most of the work for you. In 2000, a group attempted exactly that journey with a single Bluestone-sized block and a purpose-built raft as a Millennium project. The stone sank in Milford Haven, in sheltered water, before the voyage had properly begun. That is not proof that it could not be done, but it is a fairly pointed reminder of what a 3-ton deck cargo does to a small boat in a swell. The overland route now looks more likely to most specialists. It is longer on the map, but it avoids the sea entirely, running east along the Welsh valleys and across the Severn near its head. Crucially, it is the same direction people and cattle were already traveling, and the same direction the Welsh dead at Stonehenge appear to have come from. It is also the route that later became a real corridor of movement. For thousands of years afterwards, people, cattle, and goods traveled between South Wales and the Severn along broadly the same ground, because it is where the country lets you through. Overland, the mechanics are well understood. You build a sledge, a wooden frame with runners. You lash the stone to it. You lay a track ahead of the sledge and you pull. Experiments have consistently found that the surface under the sledge matters far more than the weight on it. Nothing about the method is a secret or a lost art. Every element of it, sledge, track, rope, lever, and wedge, is documented in use somewhere in the world within the last 2 centuries, moving loads of comparable weight. On rollers, on dry ground, it is hard work and the rollers keep escaping sideways. On a timber trackway, better. But the discovery that keeps being rediscovered is that a greased or wetted wooden rail is astonishingly effective. Add animal fat or simply water and mud to the runners and the friction collapses. Teams of 20 people have moved multi-ton blocks this way at walking pace. This is the recurring lesson of every experiment. People badly overestimate how much muscle is needed and badly underestimate how much preparation is. The hard part is laying the track, not pulling the load. In 2016, a group at University College London tested a sledge running on wooden rails with schoolchildren pulling it. 10 children moved a 1-ton stone comfortably. Scaled up, the arithmetic suggests that a 2-ton bluestone needs perhaps 20 to 30 adults, and that the limiting factor is not strength but organization, food, and rope. Rope, in fact, may have been the real bottleneck. There is no metal, no wire, nothing manufactured. Every meter of hauling line had to be twisted by hand from lime bast, or from rawhide, or from twisted plant fiber, and it had to be strong enough to take the shock loads of a stone catching on a rut. The rope making alone would have taken months. A single hauling line long enough and thick enough for a Bluestone team represents an extraordinary amount of work in its own right, stripping bark, retting the fiber in water for weeks, then twisting and laying it up strand by strand. And none of this happens without food. A hauling team of 30 people working through a summer has to eat every day, and so do the people making the rope and cutting the timber and feeding the haulers. Moving 80 stones across Wales is not really an engineering project. It is an agricultural one. Somebody had to grow that food in a landscape with no surplus to spare, and then agree to give it away. Every stone at Stonehenge is also a season of somebody's harvest, spent on something that produced nothing to eat. Which is the point that changes how you look at the whole thing. The technology needed to move the Bluestones was not exotic. Wood, rope, fat, water, and people. What was needed was the ability to gather hundreds of people, feed them, keep them together for years, and persuade them that this was worth doing. That is a social achievement, not a mechanical one. About 500 years after the Bluestones began arriving, somewhere around 2500 BC, the monument was transformed. This is the moment Stonehenge became the thing everybody pictures. And it involved stones an order of magnitude heavier than anything moved before. Sarsen is a hard silicified sandstone. It formed as a crust on the surface of southern England tens of millions of years ago, then broke up and was scattered across the chalk in loose blocks. In places they still lie in dry valleys and drifts, gray and lumpy, and old country people called them gray wethers because from a distance a valley full of them looks like a flock of sheep. They are the leftovers of a vanished landscape, and there are far fewer of them now than there were, because Sarsen makes excellent building stone and most of the accessible blocks in southern England were broken up and carted off long ago. Sarsen is brutally hard. It is essentially quartz sand cemented by silica, and it will blunt anything you hit it with. To shape a Sarsen block you use another Sarsen, a rounded hammerstone, swung by hand, thousands upon thousands of times, knocking off small flakes. The ground around Stonehenge is thick with the debris. You can still pick the hammerstones up. They lie in the pluff soil around the monument in their thousands, rounded, bruised at both ends, discarded when they cracked. Each one represents a day of somebody's arm aching. For centuries it was assumed the Sarsens came from the Marlborough Downs, roughly 25 kilometers north, because that is where the biggest surviving spreads are. But nobody could say which part. Then in 2020 a piece of the puzzle turned up in an unexpected place, a filing cabinet in Florida. In 1958, during a restoration, engineers had drilled a core out of one of the standing Sarsens to insert a metal tie. One of the cores was taken home by a man working on the site and kept for 60 years. In 2018, he returned it. Its interior was pristine, unweathered Sarsen, a clean chemical sample that had never been available before. It is one of the more absurd turns in the history of archaeology. The single most important physical sample ever taken from Stonehenge spent 6 decades in a tube in a private house, 4,000 miles away, while researchers argued about where the stones came from. The team matched its chemistry against Sarsen from every plausible source area in southern England. 50 of the 52 surviving Sarsens came from one place, West Woods, on the southern edge of the Marlborough Downs, about 25 kilometers from the monument. After 400 years of speculation, the quarry finally had an address. 25 kilometers is much shorter than the Welsh journey, but the loads are in another category entirely. The largest Sarsen at Stonehenge is estimated at around 30 tons. A circle upright is around 25. Each lintel is several tons and had to end up 5 meters in the air. To put that in ordinary terms, one upright weighs roughly as much as 5 African elephants, and it had to be raised from lying flat to standing vertical in a hole without dropping it, using nothing but timber, rope, and human weight. The route from West Woods runs southwest across the downs, and it is not flat. There are valleys to cross and a long climb up onto the plain. Estimates of the workforce needed vary wildly, from a couple of hundred people per stone to 1,000, depending on the friction assumptions. What everyone agrees is that it took months per stone, and that there were over 80 of them. There is also the question of how you keep several hundred people fed and organized on open downland for months at a time, in the rain, without any of them going home. That, rather than the friction coefficient, is the real problem to solve. Some of the shaping seems to have been done at the source and some on site. The uprights were dressed to a slight taper so that they appear parallel when seen from below, the same optical correction Greek architects would use on columns 2,000 years later. The lintels were curved to follow the arc of the circle. The uprights are also slightly wider at the top than in the middle, an emphasis which stops them looking pinched. Somebody stood back, looked at the effect, and corrected it in a material that takes a week of hammering to remove a centimeter. Nobody has to guess whether this was possible. The question that remains is the same one as before, and it only gets sharper as the stones get heavier. Not how. Why does a farming society with a life expectancy in the 30s spend several generations of surplus labor dragging 30-ton blocks across a landscape to make a shape? Getting a 30-ton block to the site was the long part of the job. Standing it upright was the dangerous part. A Sarsen upright is around 8 meters long, of which roughly a fifth goes into the ground, and it has to end up vertical in the right place on the circle without falling over sideways, without snapping, and without killing anybody. There is no second attempt. If the stone goes over, it will not be lifted again in that generation. The method is reasonably well understood because the sockets survive and they are shaped for it. Each hole was dug with one side cut vertically and the opposite side sloping up like a ramp. The stone was brought in along the ramp, base first, and slid down until the foot dropped against the vertical face. That face acted as a stop. The block was then levered and hauled upright, pivoting on its own base. Some of the sockets also show scoring on the vertical face, where the descending stone scraped the chalk as it dropped into place. You can read the last few seconds of the operation in the wall of the hole. The pulling was probably done with ropes over an A-frame, 2 timbers lashed at the top, standing over the hole so that the rope runs upward before it runs away horizontally. That changes the geometry entirely. Instead of dragging the top of the stone along the ground, you are lifting it, and the leverage improves with every degree it rises. Experiments have raised replica uprights of comparable weight with a few hundred people this way. Once the stone was near vertical, it had to be packed. The sockets are filled with rammed chalk rubble, flint nodules, and broken sarsen, wedged tightly around the base to hold the angle. Some of that packing has been excavated, and it is dense and deliberate. It is also the reason the stones stood for 4,500 years without mortar of any kind. There is a practical detail here that experimenters always mention. The packing has to go in fast while the ropes are still taking the load, and it has to go in evenly all the way round, or the stone will lean as soon as the tension comes off. Then came the lintels, which is the genuinely astonishing part. Each one weighs several tons and had to be lifted about 5 meters and set precisely across the tops of 2 uprights. There is no evidence for a crane and no reason to think one existed. The 2 credible methods are a long earth ramp and a timber crib. The crib method is the more elegant and most experimenters prefer it. You lay the lintel flat on the ground beside the uprights. You lever one end up a few centimeters and slide a timber underneath. You lever the other end up and slide a timber under that. Repeat. The stone rises on a growing lattice of crossed logs, a hand's width at a time, until it is level with the top of the uprights and can be slid across. The technique is not hypothetical. It has been used to move and lift heavy stone in living memory in several parts of the world, and it was demonstrated on television with a replica lintel and a small team who had never done it before. It is slow, it is safe, it needs no more than a dozen people at any moment, and it needs a great deal of timber. Given that Salisbury Plain had already been substantially cleared of woodland by this date, the timber itself may have been one of the more expensive parts of the whole operation. Everything about the Sarsens circle suggests planning rather than improvisation. The uprights are graded so the tallest are at the entrance. The tops of the lintels form a level ring, even though the ground beneath slopes, which means the sockets were dug to different depths to compensate. Somebody was working to a specification and checking it as they went. That is not the only sign of measurement. The spacing of the uprights around the circle is regular to within a few centimeters over a circumference of nearly 100 meters, which is difficult to achieve by eye and suggests some means of setting out with cord. How long did all this take? The honest answer is that estimates range enormously, from a few decades to a couple of centuries. The radiocarbon evidence for the main Sarsen phase clusters tightly around 2500 BC, which has led several researchers to argue that the great stones went up surprisingly quickly, perhaps within a single generation in one concentrated effort. If that is right, it changes the emotional shape of the story. This was not a slow accretion of monument over centuries like a cathedral. It was something closer to a national project, a burst of enormous, coordinated, short-lived effort by a society that had decided, for reasons it did not write down, that this had to be done now. And then, having built it, they did not leave it alone. The Bluestones were taken up and rearranged at least twice more. Pits were dug and refilled. Settings were added and removed. Stonehenge was not finished and admired. It was worked on, altered, and argued with for centuries after the last Sarsen went up. There is one detail of Stonehenge that specialists find stranger than the transport, stranger than the raising, and stranger than the Welsh stones. It is the joints. No other stone circle in Britain or Ireland has them. No other megalithic monument in Europe has them. And they are not structural necessities. They are the habits of people who normally built in wood. On top of each sarsen upright is a carved knob, a projecting boss of stone perhaps 15 centimeters across, left standing proud when the rest of the crown was hammered down. On the underside of each lintel is a corresponding hollow. The knob sits in the hollow, and the lintel cannot slide off. In woodworking, this is called a mortise and tenon, and it is one of the oldest joints there is. On the largest stones, the tenons are correspondingly larger, and where a lintel had to sit across two uprights of slightly different girth, the joints were cut to compensate. Each one was fitted to its own pair of stones and would not work anywhere else on the site. The lintels of the outer ring also join each other. Each has a tongue running down one end and a groove cut into the other, so that neighboring lintels interlock along their vertical faces, forming a continuous hoop rather than 30 separate slabs balanced in a row. Again, this is timber joinery, executed in stone that blunts everything you hit it with. Consider what that required. The tenon on the upright had to be positioned before the stone was raised, because afterwards it is 5 meters in the air. The mortise on the lintel had to be cut to match it, which means somebody measured the top of a stone lying on its side, transferred that measurement to another stone lying elsewhere, and got it right without written numbers. There were no rulers, no drawings, and no common unit of length that survives. Whatever they used for transferring measurements, it was almost certainly a length of rope or a marked rod, and it had to be kept safe for as long as the work went on. And they got it right at height. Once the lintel is being crept upward on a timber crib, adjusting the fit is close to impossible. The joints had to work first time, or the whole slow process had to be reversed. That is not the work of people improvising. It is the work of a tradition with standards. The most likely explanation is the simplest one. These people were superb carpenters. Britain in the 3rd millennium BC built enormous timber structures, post circles, halls, palisades of split oak. Working wood was the skill everybody had. When they came to build in stone, they did what anybody does with a new material. They used the techniques they already trusted. We have the post holes to prove it. Circles of oak posts a meter thick, halls larger than most Iron Age buildings, and palisades of split trunks driven into the chalk in their thousands are all documented across southern Britain in this period. There is another possibility that some archaeologists take seriously, which is that Stonehenge in stone is a copy of something that already existed in timber. Wooden circles with lintels would be far easier to build, and there were certainly timber circles in the surrounding landscape. If so, the stone version is a translation, a familiar thing made permanent. The idea is not merely speculation about intention. Timber circles with lintels are difficult to prove archaeologically, since only the post holes survive, but the sheer confidence of the stone joinery does argue for a long tradition of doing it in a softer material first. That reading gives the joints a different weight. They would not just be habit. They would be quotation. The tenons would be there because the original had them, and to leave them out would have made the copy wrong, in the way that a modern stone building sometimes keeps decorative features that only made sense in wood. Nobody can settle this, and it is one of many places in the Stonehenge story where a physical detail opens straight onto a question about what people were thinking. All we can say for certain is that the builders cared how it was made, not merely that it stood up. There is one more thing carved into those stones, discovered by accident in 1953, when someone photographing 16th century graffiti noticed shapes beneath it. On several of the Sarsens are carvings of bronze axes and at least one dagger, cut into the surface centuries after the monument was built. Over 100 have now been recorded by laser scan. Nobody knows who made them or why or whether they were meant to be seen. The carvings date to the Bronze Age, several hundred years after the monument was completed, and the axe shapes match real bronze axes of the period closely enough to be identified by type. Somebody in a later age stood at those stones and wanted to leave something on them. It is worth stopping here before the story moves on and trying to see the thing as it was when the last lintel was set. Because what stands on the plain today is a wreck, and a wreck reads very differently from a finished building. The Stonehenge that the builders walked away from was a far stranger object than the one on the postcards. Start with the color. Freshly worked sarsen is not the gray-brown of weathered stone. Break one open and the interior is a pale, clean, almost white gray, and the hammered surfaces would have been that color all over. A newly finished Stonehenge would have been a bright monument, standing out against green downland, visible for a considerable distance in low sun. Weathering has done the rest of the work since. Lichen, rain, frost and 4,500 years of English weather have given the surviving stones the gray and ochre mottling everybody knows, which is not a property of the stone at all but of what has grown on it. Then the completeness. 30 uprights, 30 lintels, an unbroken ring of stone standing 4.5 meters high with no gaps in it anywhere. From outside you could not see in. From inside, the horizon was cut off in every direction except upward, and through the entrance. It was, in the most exact sense, an enclosure. Try to picture that from a distance, coming up the avenue with the ground rising ahead of you. You would not see a group of standing stones. You would see a single solid pale ring with a dark gap in it, sitting on the skyline. That fact is easy to lose today because the circle is broken and you can see straight through it from most angles. But an intact ring of stone with a continuous lintel is a wall. Whatever went on inside the Sarsen circle was hidden from anybody standing on the bank, exactly as the earlier earthwork had hidden it. Inside that wall stood the 5 trilithons, rising in height toward the center, the tallest of them over 7 meters, half as tall again as the ring around it. And between and among them, the Bluestones, smaller, darker, roughly finished, arranged in settings that were changed and changed again. It would have been crowded. There is not much open floor. The Bluestones make the interior feel different again. They are irregular, some of them barely reaching a person's shoulder, standing in the shadow of things 5 times their height, and they are the only stones on the site that a small group of people could have set up unaided. The surfaces were not all treated alike, and this is a detail that took decades to notice. The inward-facing sides of the stones are more carefully dressed than the outward-facing ones. Whoever finished the monument put the effort where it would be seen from the inside. The good face is the face you see if you are standing in the middle. It is a small thing to notice and a large thing to conclude from. Effort in a building is always spent where it matters, and at Stonehenge it was spent on the surfaces that face inward, toward whoever was standing in the middle. The dressing of the northeastern stones, along the solstice axis, is finer still. The stones you walk between as you come in on the alignment are the smoothest and the most regular on the site. Everything about the construction points to arriving on foot from one particular direction and entering. And acoustically, an enclosed stone ring does something distinctive. Acoustic modeling published in 2020 using a scale replica found that the complete monument would have reinforced sound inside it and contained it. Speech and music inside the circle would carry clearly to everyone within, and rather poorly to anybody outside. It was not an echo chamber. It was a room. The researchers built a 1/12 scale model of the complete monument, with every missing stone restored, and measured its acoustics in a laboratory chamber. The effect was modest but consistent, and it was strongest for sounds made inside and heard inside. Put those pieces together and a shape emerges that is not a temple in the open air. It is a bright, enclosed, roofless room, built to be entered from one direction on one line of sight, finished on the inside, holding perhaps a few dozen people, in the middle of a landscape of the dead. That is worth holding on to because it cuts against the popular image. Stonehenge is usually pictured as a monument for crowds, silhouetted against a sunrise with thousands watching. The building itself suggests something much smaller and much more private happening within it. What happened in that room is exactly the thing we do not know. But the architecture is not neutral about it. Everything in the design says, this is for the people who come inside on the correct day from the correct direction and not for everybody. The solstice alignment is the one fact about Stonehenge that everybody knows, and it is also the fact most often stated slightly wrong. So let us be careful with it because the details matter more than the headline. The axis of the monument runs from southwest to northeast. At the northeastern end, it points to the position on the horizon where the sun rises on the longest day of the year. At the southwestern end, it points to where the sun sets on the shortest. It is a single line used in both directions 6 months apart. Those two positions are the extremes. Through the year, the sunrise point swings back and forth along the horizon, north in summer, south in winter, and at each solstice it appears to stop for a few days before turning back. That pause is what the word solstice means. Every June, tens of thousands of people gather at Stonehenge to watch the midsummer sunrise, and the image of the sun coming up beside the heel stone is famous worldwide. But there is a strong argument held by many of the archaeologists who have worked the site that midsummer is the wrong end of the line, and that the builders cared about the winter. The first piece of evidence is architectural. The great trilithon at the closed end of the horseshoe frames the midwinter sunset. If you stand at the entrance and look inward along the axis, on the shortest afternoon of the year, the sun goes down through that gap. The tallest, most carefully finished structure on the site is aimed at the setting midwinter sun. Only one upright of the great trilithon is still standing, so the frame is broken and the effect is hard to see today. When it was whole, the gap between those two stones was a narrow vertical slot with the tallest stones on the site on either side of it. The second piece is the avenue. It approaches the monument from the northeast, which means that anybody walking up it is walking toward the midwinter sunset and away from the midsummer sunrise. Monuments tend to be designed around the direction people arrive from. The procession was built to face the winter. The third piece, and the strongest, is the rubbish. The animal bones from the builder's village nearby can be aged at death from their teeth and bones, and the pigs, overwhelmingly the main meat, were being killed in midwinter. Not spread through the year. Concentrated in the dark months, around the solstice. The evidence for this comes from the way pigs grow. Their teeth erupt on a fairly reliable schedule, and pigs born in spring, as they overwhelmingly are, can be aged at death from the state of their jaws. The Dyington jaws point again and again at the same season. That makes a certain sense of everything else. Midsummer in a farming society is the busiest time of the year. Midwinter is when the work stops, the stores are full, the animals that cannot be overwintered have to be slaughtered anyway, and there is both time and food for a gathering. If you were going to call people from across Britain, you would call them in December. There is also nothing else to do. In a farming year, the weeks after the solstice are the emptiest weeks there are, and they are also the coldest and the darkest, which is precisely when a large gathering with fires and food would matter most. None of which means midsummer was ignored. It is the same line. A society that watched the horizon closely enough to build on that axis would have known perfectly well what happened at the other end of the year. The argument is about emphasis, not about exclusion. In fact, the two are inseparable in practice. Any observer who marks the midwinter sunset on a fixed line will find the midsummer sunrise sitting on the same line automatically, because the two are opposite points on the same axis of the sky. It is also worth being clear about how accurate the alignment is, because claims in both directions get exaggerated. Stonehenge is not a precision instrument. The axis is correct to within roughly a degree, which is about 2 sun widths, good enough to be unmistakably deliberate, not good enough to predict anything. It marks a day. It does not measure one. The larger claims made in the 20th century, that Stonehenge was a computer for predicting eclipses, that it encoded lunar cycles across its 56 Aubrey holes, have not survived scrutiny well. They were argued seriously by respected people, and taken apart just as seriously by others. What survives is the solstice line, the lunar rectangle of the station stones, and not much beyond that. The eclipse prediction theory was proposed in the 1960s by an astronomer using an early computer, and it caused a sensation. It was dismantled within a few years by archaeologists who pointed out that the 56 holes were dug and filled in phases, and never all stood open at once. Which is enough, and in some ways more moving than the grander version. These were people whose year was governed entirely by the sun, who had watched it swing along the horizon and come back for generations, and who built the heaviest thing they could build in order to hold the moment where it turns. There is something in that which does not need any theory at all. Anyone who has watched a winter get darker knows the feeling the monument is built around, which is the need to be certain that the sun is going to come back. For centuries, the great missing piece of the story was the people. Stonehenge itself contains almost no domestic rubbish. No hearths, no houses, no broken cooking pots in any quantity. Whoever built it did not live there. And until quite recently, nobody knew where they had lived instead. The answer turned up 2 miles northeast, at a place called Dyngton Walls, on a slope running down to the River Avon. There had long been a huge earthwork there, an enclosure nearly half a kilometre across, one of the largest in Britain. What nobody expected was what lay under the turf inside and around it. The enclosure had been known and partly dug since the 1960s, when a road was driven through part of it, but it had been read as a ceremonial earthwork like many others on the plain. Nobody had thought to look for ordinary houses. Excavations from 2004 onwards uncovered houses. Small square buildings, about 5 meters aside, with chalk floors so well preserved that the excavators could see the oval scorch of the hearth in the middle, the slots where wooden furniture had stood against the walls, and the compacted paths where feet had gone in and out of the door. The preservation was extraordinary because chalk takes an impression and holds it. Where somebody had knelt by the fire, the floor was worn. Where a box or a bed had stood, the chalk was protected and stands slightly higher. You can read the furniture from the wear. The dating placed them at around 2500 BC, precisely the period when the Sarsens were being raised. Geophysical survey suggested the settlement may have contained something in the region of 1,000 houses. If even a fraction of those were occupied at once, Dyngton Walls was, for a short time, one of the largest settlements in Northern Europe. And it did not last. The occupation layers are thin and the material is tightly dated. This was not a town that grew over generations. It appears to have been built, filled, used intensely, and abandoned within a span of perhaps a few decades. It exists for as long as the stones are going up, and then it stops. That brevity is the single most important fact about the place. A settlement of 1,000 houses that lasts 30 years is not a community. It is a construction camp or a pilgrimage site, and either way it exists because of the stones. What was found in the houses is as telling as the houses themselves. Enormous quantities of animal bone and broken pottery, far more per household than a normal settlement produces. Very little evidence of the ordinary business of living. Few tools for craft work, little sign of grain being processed, almost no corns for grinding. People were eating there on an extraordinary scale and doing almost nothing else. That is not a village. That is accommodation for an event. And the food remains, say, the same thing. Pig and cattle, roasted rather than boiled, sometimes with whole joints discarded still bearing meat, which is the signature of feasting rather than of subsistence. Analysis of residues absorbed into the pottery walls confirmed it. The pots held dairy products and animal fats, and many of the vessels were large serving forms rather than everyday cooking pots. Whole animals were being cooked and shared, not portioned out carefully. Some of the pig bones carry arrowheads. The animals had been shot, possibly hunted for sport within an enclosure, possibly killed in some ritual manner rather than butchered efficiently. Whichever it was, nobody trying to feed a workforce cheaply kills their pigs with arrows. The wastefulness is part of the evidence. Joints of meat were thrown away half-eaten and bones were discarded without being split for marrow, which people almost never do when food is scarce. This was deliberate abundance, of the kind that only makes sense as display or celebration. Inside the great enclosure at Dyington were two timber circles, one of them very large, built of enormous oak posts. And their alignments are the mirror image of Stonehenge's. The southern circle faces the midwinter sunrise, where Stonehenge faces the midwinter sunset. The two monuments are two halves of one arrangement, pointing at opposite ends of the same shortest day. The southern circle at Dyington was a substantial building in its own right, with concentric rings of oak posts, the largest of them nearly a meter across and sunk more than 2 meters into the chalk. In timber terms, it was the equal of anything in stone. Running from Dyington down to the river is its own short avenue, a metalled roadway of packed flint, aimed at the midsummer sunset. And 2.5 miles downstream, the Stonehenge Avenue comes up from the same river. The two sites are joined by water. It is very hard to look at that arrangement and not see a route. The proposal that follows from this, argued most forcefully by the team that excavated Dyington, is that the two sites were a pair: timber for the living and the feast, stone for the ancestors and the dead, with the river as the passage between them. The bones from Dyington walls have turned out to be one of the richest sources of information about Neolithic Britain that anybody has ever excavated, and what they have revealed is not really about diet. It is about how far people came. The technique is isotope analysis. As an animal grows, the chemistry of the water it drinks and the plants it eats is written into its teeth and bones. Strontium from the local bedrock, oxygen from the rainfall, sulfur reflecting distance from the sea. Teeth stop changing once formed. They preserve a record of where an animal spent its early life. Strontium is the most useful of these because it varies sharply between different rock types, and Britain happens to have an unusually varied geology packed into a small island. An animal raised on granite carries a different signature from one raised on chalk, and the difference survives burial. Applied to the cattle and pigs from Dyington, the results were startling. The animals had not been raised locally. Their chemistry pointed to a wide range of different geologies: the west of Britain, the far north, regions with entirely different bedrock from the chalk of Salisbury Plain. Some had come from what is now Scotland, which means the animals walked. There is no other way to move a herd of cattle 500 miles in 2500 BC. And people walked with them, driving them across rivers and through forest for weeks in order to arrive at a particular place at a particular time of year and eat them. Cattle move at about 10 miles a day if you do not want to ruin them, and they have to be fed and watered on the way. A drive from northern Britain to Salisbury Plain is a journey of well over a month, undertaken in the season before midwinter. This is one of the most remarkable facts in British prehistory, and it is easy to skate over. It means that at least once a year at midwinter, people from opposite ends of the island converged on one spot on Salisbury Plain. It means they knew about it. It means the knowledge of when and where to come was shared across 1,000 kilometers of a country with no writing. Think about what that requires in a world without writing, maps, or clocks. The date had to be agreed, the route had to be known, and the arrangement had to be reliable enough that people would set out weeks in advance on the strength of it. It also implies something about why. If the point had simply been to feed a workforce, you would raise the animals nearby. Driving cattle from Scotland is spectacularly inefficient as catering. But it makes perfect sense as contribution, as each community bringing its own animals, its own share, to a common table. There is an ordinary human logic to that which needs no anthropology at all. People who travel a long way to a gathering bring something with them, and what they bring is a statement about who they are and what they can afford to give. The pottery supports this. The styles found at Dyington include forms and decoration characteristic of different regions of Britain, sitting side by side in the same deposits. Different traditions of making in the same rubbish heap in the same few decades. Grooved ware, the pottery style of the period, has regional variants that specialists can tell apart, and Dyington contains several of them together. It is one of the clearest material signs anywhere in prehistoric Britain that people from different regions were physically in the same room. So the picture that emerges is not of a king commanding labor, and not of slaves. It is of something more like a periodic assembly. People traveling enormous distances, bringing food, staying in temporary houses on the slope above the river, eating together in the dark of the year, and working on the stones while they were there. That model has become the leading interpretation of Stonehenge over the past 20 years, and its appeal is that it explains the labor problem without inventing an unevidenced ruling class. Nobody had to be forced. The building was the reason for the gathering, and the gathering was the reason for the building. It also fits what we know about the society more broadly. There are no palaces in Neolithic Britain, no royal graves of the kind found later, and no evidence of a standing elite with the power to compel thousands of people for years at a time. Whether that is right, we cannot prove. But it does account for the geography, the timing, the animals, the pottery, the houses that lasted a generation, and the strange fact that the largest settlement in Neolithic Britain existed for a few decades beside a stone circle and then disappeared completely. Whatever else Stonehenge was, then, it seems to have been a reason for the whole island to come together, at the coldest and darkest point of the year, for as long as the building lasted and for some centuries after it was done. Leading away from the northeastern entrance of Stonehenge is a feature that most visitors never register at all, because after 5,000 years of plowing there is almost nothing left of it above ground. It is called the Avenue, and it consists of two parallel ditches with low banks inside them, running about 12 meters apart. When it was new, those banks would have been white chalk, and it would have looked like a bright double line drawn across the grass, leading straight to the stones. It leaves the monument along the solstice axis and runs dead straight for about 500 meters, downhill into a shallow valley and then up the far side. That first straight section is the important one. It is the stretch that carries the alignment, and it runs precisely over the periglacial stripes in the chalk, those natural grooves left by the ice that happened to point at the midsummer sunrise. The road was laid on top of a line the land had already drawn. At the top of the rise, at a place called the Avenue's Elbow, it turns. From there it swings east, then southeast, then curves down through the landscape for another 2.5 kilometers, until it reaches the bank of the River Avon at a spot called West Amesbury. The straight part is astronomy. The long curved part is simply a route, and it takes the easiest ground. In 2008 and 2009, archaeologists dug at the river end and found something at the bottom of it. A small circle of standing stones, about 10 meters across, set inside a low earthwork right at the water's edge. The stones themselves were gone, but the sockets were there, and the sizes matched bluestones. It was nicknamed Stonehenge, and it appears to have been dismantled and its stones taken up the avenue. The excavators found the sockets packed with the same kind of rammed rubble used at Stonehenge itself, and the stumps of the packing still held the impression of the stones that had been lifted out of them. The removal had been careful rather than destructive. That discovery completed a shape that had been suspected for years. A small stone circle at the river. A processional road from the river to the great monument. And 2.5 miles upstream, another avenue running from the river up to Dynton Walls and its timber circles. The whole complex is strung along the water, with the river as the connecting thread between the world of the living and the world of the stones. Whether people actually traveled by boat between the two is unknown and probably unknowable. What is clear is that both major sites were deliberately linked to the same river, both had formal roads leading down to it, and both were built with the midwinter solstice in their alignments. The design is not two monuments near each other. It is one arrangement covering several square miles. The avenue also tells you how Stonehenge was meant to be experienced, and it is not the way anybody experiences it today. Modern visitors approach from a car park to the west and see the stones side-on gradually from a distance. Somebody walking the avenue came up out of a valley and met the monument face-on, along its axis, with the entrance and the great trilithon lined up ahead of them. Anyone who has visited will recognize how much that matters. The monument seen from the side is a jumble of leaning shapes with no clear front. Seen along the axis, it resolves into a symmetrical facade with a doorway in the middle of it. There is a moment on that walk, coming up the last rise, when the stones would have appeared above the skyline all at once. Archaeologists who have walked the line describe it as a designed reveal. The ground hides the monument until you are close, and then gives it to you whole. Whether the builders intended that effect we cannot say, but they certainly chose the route. The dating of the avenue puts its construction several centuries after the first Sarsens were raised, somewhere around 2300 BC. So the road came later than the building. The monument existed first, and then somebody decided that the way people arrived at it needed to be formalized, marked out in chalk and fixed permanently on the line of the sun. The dating comes from antler picks left in the avenue ditches, which give a construction date after the Sarsen circle was standing and after the Bluestones had been rearranged at least once. The road belongs to the monument's maturity, not to its beginning. That sequence is quietly revealing. It suggests that the practice of coming to Stonehenge in numbers from a particular direction was already well established, and that the avenue was built to regularize something people were doing anyway. Roads generally follow feet. This one seems to have followed a great many of them. There is an ordinary parallel for that in almost any landscape. Paths get worn before they get paved, and the decision to pave one is usually a decision about ceremony or control rather than about convenience. And at the far end, at the river, the small circle was taken away and its stones apparently carried up to the main site. Even in the middle of its greatest period, Stonehenge was pulling material toward itself. Stones came from Wales, stones came from Scotland, stones came from the riverbank 2 miles away. Everything was moving inward. To understand Stonehenge properly, you have to accept something about the landscape it stood in that is very hard to see now because it has all rotted away. Stonehenge was surrounded by enormous buildings made of wood, and in their own time those buildings were probably just as impressive as the stones. We only remember the stones because stone is what survives. 2 miles away at Dyington were the 2 timber circles, one of them with concentric rings of oak posts a meter thick. Half a mile south of that is Woodhenge, discovered from the air in 1925 when a pilot photographed a pattern of dark circles in a wheat field. Excavation found 6 concentric ovals of post holes inside a ditch and bank, 168 posts in all. The pilot was Squadron Leader Gilbert Inzall, who had won the Victoria Cross in the previous war and had developed an eye for the faint marks that buried features make in a growing crop. Aerial photography was transforming archaeology in exactly those years, and Woodhenge was one of its first great prizes. Woodhenge is aligned on the midsummer sunrise, like Stonehenge, and its proportions echo the stone monument closely enough that some archaeologists have called it a timber version of the same idea. The posts are gone, of course. Today the site is marked with concrete bollards, color-coded by ring, which is honest but not especially atmospheric. At the center of Woodhenge, the excavators found the burial of a young child, apparently placed there deliberately when the monument was built. The record of that discovery is thin by modern standards, and the remains were later lost in the war, which means one of the most striking finds on the plain can never be re-examined. Then there is the southern circle at Dyington, larger still, and a whole series of other timber settings scattered across the plain, some of them known only from geophysical survey and never excavated. The chalk downland around Stonehenge in 2500 BC was crowded with great circular wooden buildings, standing at the same time as the stones. Geophysical survey of the wider landscape in the 2010s mapped many more anomalies of the same kind, including a line of enormous pits arcing around Dyington walls more than 2 kilometers across. Almost none of these features are visible from the ground, and most have never been dug. This has produced one of the most influential ideas in modern Stonehenge scholarship, and it came from an unexpected direction. In the 1990s, a Malagasy archaeologist, Ramila Sanina, working with British colleagues, pointed out that in his own society the distinction between wood and stone is not a distinction of cost or fashion. Wood is for the living. Stone is for the ancestors. Applied to Salisbury Plain, that suggestion made a great deal fall into place. Dyington, with its houses, its feasts, its rubbish and its timber circles, would be the domain of the living. Stonehenge, with its cremated bone, its silence, its permanence and its absence of everyday life, would be the domain of the dead. The river between them would be the passage from one to the other. In that reading, the journey mattered as much as the destinations. You would gather among the timber and the fires and the noise of the living, and then move down river and up the avenue to the silent stone place where the dead were, and then go home. It is an interpretation, and it rests on an analogy drawn from a society separated from Neolithic Britain by 4,000 years and half the planet. Plenty of archaeologists have said so. But it is a rare example of a theory that predicted things which were then found, including the small stone circle at the river end of the avenue, which the model expected to be there. What the timber world certainly does is correct the perspective. Stonehenge was not a lone marvel in an empty landscape, made by people who could do nothing else. It was the one permanent structure in a landscape full of large, sophisticated, carefully aligned buildings, most of which have vanished without trace apart from stains in the chalk. There is a bias built into all archaeology that is worth naming here. We reconstruct the past out of whatever refused to decay, which means we systematically overweight stone, pottery, and bone, and systematically underweight wood, cloth, leather, basketry, and everything else people actually used every day. It also explains why the stone joinery looks like carpentry. If you have spent generations building great circular structures out of oak with lintels tenoned onto posts, and you then decide to build one that will last forever, you will build the same shape. The permanent version is a copy of the ordinary version. Look at the Sarsens circle with that in mind, and its proportions change. It is not the shape of a stone building at all. It is the shape of a very large wooden one, reproduced at enormous cost in a material that will not burn or rot. So the strangeness of Stonehenge is not that people built a circle. Circles were what they built. The strangeness is that this one was made out of something that would not rot, in a material dragged from the other end of the country, at a cost nobody has ever been able to justify by any practical measure. That is the question the whole monument keeps returning you to, and it does not get easier with more evidence. Everything about how they did it is answerable. Everything about why is a matter of inference from rubbish, geometry, and the position of the sun. Stonehenge is, above everything else that can be said about it, a burial ground. That is not a fringe interpretation or a recent idea. It is the single best evidenced fact about the monument's use, and it covers the longest span of its history. People were putting their dead there for well over 500 years. The earliest burials belong to the first phase, around 3000 BC, and they are cremations. Bodies were burned elsewhere, the bones gathered up, and the remains placed in the Aubrey holes, in the ditch and in the bank. The excavations of the 1920s recovered a great deal of this material, and then, in a decision that still causes archaeologists physical pain, reburied most of it in a single hole because it was thought to be scientifically useless. The decision was made by William Hawley, who excavated roughly half the site in the 1920s under difficult conditions and with almost no funding. He has been criticized heavily since, but he was working before radiocarbon dating existed, and cremated bone was genuinely considered incapable of yielding information. That hole, known as Aubrey Hole 7, was reopened in 2008. The bone was recovered, and modern techniques were applied to material that had been written off 80 years earlier. Careful analysis identified the remains of at least 58 individuals from that one deposit, and the total buried at Stonehenge is now estimated at around 150 people, perhaps more. The demographic profile is unusual for what one might expect of a high-status monument. There are adult men and adult women in roughly equal numbers. There are children, including infants. There are old people. It is not a warrior cemetery, not a royal tomb, and not obviously a selection of one class. Whatever the criterion for burial was, it was not sex, age, or anything visible in the bones. There are hints of selection somewhere in the process because 150 burials over 500 years is not many people. Whole communities were not being buried here. Somebody was choosing, and we have no way of knowing what the criterion was. Because the bodies were cremated, most of the questions we would like to ask cannot be answered. Cremation destroys collagen, which is where ancient DNA lives, so there is no genetic evidence from these people at all. It also destroys most disease indicators. What survives is the mineral component of the bone, and that is where the one great insight has come from. That absence is one of the sharpest frustrations in British archaeology. For almost every other major site of this period, there is now genetic evidence, and the picture it gives is detailed and often surprising. For the people actually buried at Stonehenge, there is nothing and there never will be. Strontium is incorporated into bone from food and water, and it reflects the geology of wherever a person was living. Crucially, it survives cremation, locked into the mineral structure. In 2018, a study analyzed 25 individuals from Aubrey Hole 7 and found that 10 of them had strontium values inconsistent with life on chalk downland. Those values were consistent with Western Britain, and the region that matched best was West Wales. The same part of the country the Bluestones came from. The researchers were careful about their claims because strontium can only rule places out rather than pin one down, but the pattern is there and it is not easily explained away. Strontium works by exclusion rather than identification. A value can tell you that somebody did not grow up on chalk, and it can tell you which broad geologies are compatible with the reading, but it cannot point at a village. Several regions of Britain would fit these results, and West Wales fits best. It also emerged that some of these people had been living in the West shortly before they died. The chemistry of a person's bone updates over roughly the last decade of life. So these were not people who had moved to Wiltshire as children and grown old there. Some of them came east near the end. What does one do with that? It is possible that a community with strong Welsh connections lived on the plain. It is possible that the dead were carried across Britain to be buried at Stonehenge, as later societies carried their dead to sacred places over comparable distances. It is possible that both are true. The evidence does not choose. Both readings are attested elsewhere in the world, which is precisely the difficulty. Medieval Europe carried its dead considerable distances to particular churches, and plenty of societies have contained communities living far from their ancestral ground. The evidence is consistent with both and decides neither. What it does establish is the character of the place. For 20 generations, Stonehenge was somewhere you took the dead. Not a temple where things were done to the living, or at least not only that. A cemetery of national reach in a landscape already thick with tombs, at the end of a road that came up from a river. In 2002, a few miles from Stonehenge, workers preparing the ground for a new housing development at Amesbury uncovered a grave. What came out of it turned into the richest burial of its period ever found in Britain, and it arrived with a set of implications that nobody had been expecting. The man in the grave was between 35 and 45. He had been buried on his side with his knees drawn up, in the standard posture of his period, and around him were around 100 objects. That is an extraordinary number. Most graves of this date in Britain contain 2 or 3 things, or nothing at all. He had 5 beaker pots, the distinctive tall decorated drinking vessels that give the period its name. He had 16 barbed and tanged flint arrowheads, which is why he is known as the Amesbury Archer, and 2 stone wrist guards of the kind an archer wears to protect the forearm from the bowstring. He had boar tusks, flint tools, and a cushion stone used in metalworking. Beaker pots are one of the most recognizable artifacts in European prehistory, tall and waisted with bands of impressed decoration made by pressing cord or a comb into the wet clay. Chemical residues show that some of them held fermented drink, which is where the name comes from. And he had gold. 2 small ornaments of sheet gold, probably hair or ear ornaments, which are among the earliest gold objects ever found in Britain. He also had 3 copper knives, from sources in Spain and western France. In a country that had no metal at all a few generations earlier, this man was buried with both of the metals that would define the next age. The date placed him at around 2400 to 2200 BC, which is roughly the period when the Sarsens were standing and the avenue was being built. He lived alongside Stonehenge at the height of its use, and he was buried within sight of it. That alone would have made the grave important. The grave was found by accident during evaluation work ahead of a school and housing scheme in ground nobody expected to be significant. It is a useful reminder that almost everything we know about the Stonehenge landscape has come from digging in advance of construction rather than from choosing where to look. Then they tested his teeth. The oxygen isotopes in tooth enamel record the temperature and rainfall of the water somebody drank as a child, and his values were nothing like those of southern England. They indicated a cold continental climate. The best match was the Alpine region, somewhere in what is now Switzerland, Austria, or southern Germany. Oxygen isotopes work because rainfall chemistry varies with temperature and distance from the ocean, and because tooth enamel forms in childhood and never changes afterwards. A person carries the climate of their childhood in their mouth for the rest of their life. The Amesbury archer had walked or sailed or both from Central Europe to Salisbury Plain. He had also had a difficult life. His left kneecap was missing, torn away by an injury that left the joint permanently damaged, and he had lived for years with a chronic bone infection in the wound. He would have walked with a pronounced limp and in constant pain across a continent. That detail is the one people remember. A man with a destroyed knee and an infected wound that never healed made a journey of well over 1,000 kilometers, arrived in a country at the edge of the known world, and was buried there with more wealth than anyone else of his generation in Britain. A second grave nearby held a younger man, aged about 25, who shared a rare inherited skeletal trait with the archer, a fused bone in the foot. They were almost certainly relatives, father and son or close kin. But this younger man's teeth said he had grown up in southern England. 1 generation and the family was local. The archer's grave is often described in the press as the burial of a king, and it is worth resisting that. What the objects show is not necessarily rulership. Several of them relate to metalworking, and in a society encountering copper and gold for the first time, a person who could turn rock into metal would have been regarded as something close to a magician. The cushion stone found with him is the giveaway. It is a small, hard, smooth block used as an anvil for working sheet metal, and it is the tool of a specialist. He may have been valued not for who his family was but for what he could do. He is also not alone. The years around 2400 BC see the arrival across Britain of a whole new package. The beaker pottery, the archery equipment, the copper daggers, the crouched individual burial under a round mound. It replaces the older tradition of collective tombs and cremation deposits almost completely, and it happens quickly. The change in burial custom is the most visible part of it. Neolithic Britain buried its dead communally, mixed together in tombs and deposits, with individuals largely anonymous. Beaker Britain buried one person at a time, on their side with their own possessions under their own mound. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists argued fiercely about whether that package arrived with people or merely as a fashion. Pots do not have to mean migrants. Ideas travel. The debate ran for decades without resolution because the evidence available could not settle it. And then, quite suddenly, a completely different kind of evidence became available. The argument even had a slogan, "Pots not people," and for a long time the fashionable position was that migration explanations were old-fashioned and faintly disreputable. Archaeology had spent decades correcting the earlier habit of explaining every change by invasion, and had perhaps overcorrected. In 2018, a team of geneticists published the results of an ancient DNA study covering 400 individuals from Beaker period Europe, including a substantial number from Britain. It was, at the time, one of the largest studies of its kind ever attempted, and its findings for Britain were blunt enough that the authors themselves described them as surprising. The ancestry of the people living in Britain changed by around 90% within a few centuries of 2450 BC. The Neolithic farming population, the people who had built Stonehenge, the long barrows, the causewayed enclosures, everything, was almost entirely replaced in the genetic record by newcomers carrying ancestry ultimately derived from the steppe of Eastern Europe. The steppe ancestry in question had itself spread west across Europe over the preceding few centuries, associated with the corded ware culture and ultimately with populations from the grasslands north of the Black Sea. Britain was near the end of a process that had already reshaped much of the continent. That is not a subtle signal. A 90% turnover is among the most dramatic population changes documented anywhere in European prehistory. Whatever happened in Britain between about 2450 and 2000 BC, it was not a slow blending. The descendants of the people who raised the Sarsens make up a small fraction of the ancestry of Bronze Age Britain. The obvious question is whether this means invasion, and the honest answer is that DNA cannot tell you. Genetics records the outcome, not the process. 90% replacement is compatible with violence, but it is also compatible with disease, with a collapse in the existing population's birth rate, with incomers holding a demographic advantage over several centuries, or with any combination. It is worth being careful here because this is exactly the kind of finding that gets flattened in the retelling. The geneticists themselves were explicit that their data described ancestry proportions over time and said nothing whatever about the mechanism. There is a real possibility that disease played a part. Plague, Yersinia pestis, has been recovered from Bronze Age skeletons across Europe from exactly this period. A population with no prior exposure meeting a new pathogen is a very well-attested way for a society to empty out without anybody drawing a sword. The strain recovered from these skeletons was an early form, apparently lacking the genes that later allowed transmission by fleas, but capable of causing pneumonic infection. Several European populations show sharp declines in exactly the centuries when it appears in the record. There are also hints that the Neolithic population was already in trouble. Pollen records suggest woodland regenerating across parts of Britain in the centuries before the Beaker arrival, which usually means fields going out of use. The great communal projects had largely stopped. Something was going wrong before the newcomers arrived, not after. Radiocarbon dates from across Britain show a marked fall in the number of dated sites in the centuries before 2500 BC, which is usually read as a real decline in population. The society that built Stonehenge may have been past its peak while it was still building. What this does to the Stonehenge story is stark, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. The people who quarried the Bluestones, who dragged the Sarsens, who feasted at Dynton and buried their dead in the Aubrey holes, have almost no descendants among the later inhabitants of Britain. Their line does not continue. Their language, whatever it was, is gone without a trace. And yet the newcomers did not destroy the monument. They used it. Beaker burials cluster around Stonehenge in large numbers. Round barrows of the new type were raised across the plain in their hundreds, positioned in sight of the stones. The bronze axe carvings on the Sarsens were made in this period. The concentration is remarkable in itself. There are more round barrows within a few miles of Stonehenge than almost anywhere else in Britain, and their positions were plainly chosen with the monument in view, ringing it on the higher ground and skylines around the valley. So the picture is not one of conquest and desecration. It is stranger than that. A new population with different ancestry, different burial customs, different pottery and metal tools, arrived in a country containing an enormous stone monument that they had not built and could not have explained, and they treated it with evident reverence for another 1,000 years. There is a modern parallel that makes it easier to feel. Every cathedral in Europe is used, admired, and protected by people who have no idea how it was built, no connection to the workforce, and often no share in the beliefs that raised it. Something must have carried across that gap. Not necessarily accurate knowledge, more likely story, reputation, and the plain physical authority of the thing itself. Whatever the incomers were told about Stonehenge, it was enough to make them want to be buried beside it. Monuments rarely end dramatically. There is usually no final ceremony, no last day, no moment anybody would have recognized as the end. What happens is that the intervals between visits get longer, the repairs stop being made, and 1 year nobody comes. Stonehenge ended like that over several centuries, and the archaeology can just about follow it. The last major construction work at the site is dated to around 1600 BC. It consists of 2 concentric rings of pits outside the Sarsen circle, known as the Y and Z holes, dug in the chalk. What is telling is that they were never used. No stones were placed in them. They silted up naturally, layer by layer, with wind-blown soil. The Y and Z holes are irregular, unevenly spaced and rather poorly dug compared with the earlier earthworks on the site, which some archaeologists have taken as a sign of declining organization. Whoever cut them was not working to the standard of the people who dug the original ditch. Those empty pits are, in their quiet way, one of the most eloquent things on the site. Somebody planned an expansion of Stonehenge, dug perhaps 60 holes for it, which is weeks of labor with antler picks, and then it did not happen. The project was abandoned partway through, and nobody ever came back to finish it. After that, the deposits at Stonehenge thin out. There is Bronze Age material, there is some Iron Age activity, but nothing on the scale of what came before. The gatherings had stopped. The great pig feasts at Dyington were already centuries in the past by then, that settlement having ended around 2450 BC. Iron Age and Roman finds do turn up in the pluff soil around the stones in reasonable numbers, so people continued to visit. But visiting is not the same as using. Nothing was built, nothing was rearranged, and nothing was deposited on a scale that suggests organized ceremony. Why did it stop? There is no single accepted answer, but several changes were happening at once, and they point the same way. The population had changed. Metal had arrived, and with it new forms of wealth that could be owned by individuals rather than displayed collectively. Burial was becoming personal. A barrow for one important person rather than a shared deposit of cremated bone. Each of those shifts pulls in the same direction, away from the collective and toward the individual. A society that has begun to concentrate wealth and status in particular people has less use for a monument whose entire logic is that everybody comes together at once. The climate may have played a part as well. There is evidence for a shift toward cooler and wetter conditions in northern Europe during the 2nd millennium BC, and for the abandonment of upland farming in parts of Britain. Societies under agricultural stress rarely have the surplus to spend on ceremonial architecture. And there is a more mundane possibility, which is that the reason simply expired. Monuments serve purposes, and purposes have lifespans. Whatever gathering, cycle, alliance, or belief made it necessary for the whole island to converge on Salisbury Plain in midwinter may have ceased to matter. Not because anything terrible happened, but because society had reorganized around something else. That explanation is the least dramatic and quite possibly the most likely. Institutions end all the time without catastrophe. They simply stop being the answer to a question anybody is still asking, and one generation does not pass on the reason to the next. What is remarkable is how long the respect outlasted the use. Barrows continued to be raised in the landscape around Stonehenge for centuries after the last work on the stones. Bronze Age communities kept choosing to bury their dead in view of it. The monument had stopped being a place where things were done and had become a place that mattered. By the time of the Iron Age, around 700 BC, Stonehenge was already ancient beyond memory. There was a hill fort a mile away at Vespasian's camp, and people certainly knew the stones were there, but there is little sign of significant activity at the monument itself. It had become part of the scenery. Vespasian's camp is an Iron Age hill fort on the ridge above the river, and excavation in the surrounding area has produced traces of activity going back much further, including a spring that was visited over thousands of years. People lived around Stonehenge continuously. They simply stopped doing anything with it. And so, quietly, without any recorded ending, the thing passed out of use and into the landscape. Everything that has happened to Stonehenge since, every theory, every excavation, every myth about giants and wizards and druids, has been done by people who had no more idea what it was for than we do. That is the peculiar position we are all in with this monument, and it is worth saying clearly. Every explanation offered in the last 2,000 years, including every one offered tonight, has been produced by somebody standing outside a tradition that ended before written history began. For the next 2,500 years, Stonehenge stands on the plain and almost nothing happens to it that anybody wrote down. It weathers. Stones fall. Grass grows over the ditch. Sheep graze between the uprights. And every so often somebody comes along, looks at it, and produces an explanation, each of which tells us far more about the person explaining than about the monument. The Romans certainly knew it was there. Roman pottery, coins, and metalwork have been recovered from the site in quantity, and a road ran within a couple of miles of it. There is even a suggestion, from the pattern of the finds, that some Romans deliberately damaged parts of the monument, though the evidence is thin and disputed. What is striking is that no Roman author mentions it at all. The finds include material from across the Roman period, from the 1st century through to the 4th, which suggests continued visiting rather than a single episode. Some of it was deposited in the ditch, in the way that people have always dropped things at places they come to look at. That silence is genuinely odd. Roman writers were interested in the marvels of the provinces and recorded far less impressive things elsewhere. Either Stonehenge was not considered remarkable by people who had seen Egypt and Greece, or it was so thoroughly part of the local landscape by then that nobody thought to write it down. Neither explanation is very satisfying. The Anglo-Saxons gave it a name, and the name is what we still use. Stonehenge appears to derive from Old English words meaning stone and hinge, or possibly stone and gallows, a reference either to the way the lintels hang on the uprights, or to the resemblance of a trilithon to a two-post gibbet. It is a plain, practical, descriptive name, and it suggests that by the early medieval period nobody had a better one. Names are one of the few things that can carry across a cultural break, and this one carries almost nothing. It describes the shape and says nothing about the purpose, which strongly implies that by the time English speakers arrived, the meaning had been gone for a very long time indeed. There is at least one Saxon burial at the site, a man decapitated with a sword, buried in a shallow grave, dated to around the 7th century. Executions at boundary monuments and ancient earthworks are well documented in Anglo-Saxon England. It is a bleak little detail, and it suggests the stones were regarded as a marginal place, suitable for the disposal of the condemned. He was a man of about 30, killed by 2 or 3 blows of a sword, and his skeleton was found in 1923, lost during the war, and rediscovered in a museum collection in the 1990s, at which point it could finally be dated properly. Then, in the 12th century, Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote the story that would define Stonehenge for the next 600 years. In his History of the Kings of Britain, the monument is a memorial to hundreds of British nobles treacherously murdered by the Saxons. Aurelius Ambrosius asks how they might be commemorated, and is directed to Merlin. Merlin tells him of the Giants' Dance, a circle of stones standing on Mount Kilometres in Ireland, brought there long ago from Africa by giants, and possessed of healing properties. Water poured over them and used to bathe the sick would cure any illness. An army is sent, defeats the Irish, and finds it cannot move the stones by force at all. The healing detail is the part that later writers seized on, and it has never quite gone away. It reappears in modern form whenever somebody proposes that the Bluestones were valued for supposed curative properties, which remains one of the standing theories about why they were brought so far. So Merlin does it by art rather than strength, dismantles the circle, ships it to Britain, and re-erects it on Salisbury Plain exactly as it stood before. It is a wonderful story, and it was believed in outline for centuries. Geoffrey was regarded as a historian, and his account appears in serious works well into the early modern period. And here is the part that makes historians pause. Geoffrey says the stones came from the west, from Ireland, across water, brought by someone with knowledge rather than force, and that they had been standing as a circle somewhere else before being rebuilt in England. In 1136, there was no way for anybody to know that the Bluestones came from West Wales, on the Irish Sea, and may have stood in a circle there first. None of this makes Geoffrey a reliable source. He also has giants carrying the stones from Africa, and his history contains a great deal that is demonstrably invented. But the shape of the story, stones moved from a western place where they already stood, is an odd thing to guess correctly. It is almost certainly coincidence. Geoffrey was a storyteller, working with older Welsh traditions, and any account of stones arriving from somewhere would naturally point west toward the Irish Sea. But it is one of those details that will not quite lie down, and it is regularly raised whenever the Welsh origin of the Bluestones is discussed. Through the Middle Ages, the monument sat in the sheep country of Wiltshire, half legend and half quarry, visited by the curious, chipped at by the acquisitive, and drawn occasionally by travelers who could not get the proportions right. Nobody dug. Nobody measured properly. And the idea that you might learn something from the ground itself had not yet occurred to anyone. Even the drawings are unreliable. Early depictions get the number of stones wrong, invent symmetry that is not there, and in some cases show arrangements that could never have existed. It is a reminder of how hard it is to see an unfamiliar thing accurately before you have a framework for it. The modern study of Stonehenge begins in the 17th century, and it begins with a king. In 1620, James I visited the monument, was intrigued, and commissioned his surveyor of the king's works, the architect Inigo Jones, to investigate it. It is the first time anybody in authority had asked what the thing actually was. Jones concluded it was Roman. His reasoning was frankly circular. The ancient Britons were barbarians. Barbarians could not build in the classical manner. Stonehenge is built in a manner he considered classical, therefore Romans. He also produced a reconstruction with a sixfold symmetry the monument does not have, apparently having adjusted the survey to fit the theory. Jones died before publishing, and the work appeared after his death, edited by his assistant. It was influential for a century regardless, largely because it was the first substantial book anybody had written on the subject and because its author was the most famous architect in England. Then came John Aubrey, an antiquary of enormous curiosity and very little discipline, who surveyed the site in the 1660s and noticed the ring of shallow depressions inside the bank that now carry his name. Aubrey was the first to argue seriously that Stonehenge was British rather than Roman, and the first to link it with the Druids. Aubrey came to Stonehenge with an advantage nobody before him had. He had also studied Avebury, a far larger stone circle 20 miles north, which he had come across while out hunting. Seeing two such monuments in the same region made a purely Roman explanation much harder to sustain. His reasoning was not unreasonable given what he knew. Classical authors describe Druids as the priests of the ancient Britons who worshipped in sacred groves. Stonehenge was evidently a religious site built by ancient Britons. There was no chronology to speak of, no way of dating anything, and therefore no reason not to connect the two. The idea was taken up and enormously amplified in the 18th century by William Stukeley, who is a genuinely important figure and a frustrating one. As a field worker, he was superb. He surveyed Stonehenge and Avebury with real precision, recorded features that have since been destroyed by plowing, and was the first person to note that the axis pointed at the midsummer sunrise. Stukeley also recognized that the avenue was a deliberate feature and traced it further than anyone had before, and he identified the cursus. Much of what he recorded on the ground has since been plowed flat, which means his drawings are now primary evidence in their own right. As a theorist, he went off the rails entirely. Stukeley became convinced that the Druids had practiced a pure patriarchal religion descended from Abraham, and that Stonehenge was essentially a proto-Christian temple. He took holy orders, styled himself a Druid, and folded his excellent measurements into a scheme with no evidential basis whatever. There is a real tension in his career that is worth noticing. The same man who established the solstice alignment, one of the most durable facts about the monument, also produced pages of theology that no archaeologist has ever been able to use for anything. The Druid connection then escaped from scholarship entirely and became part of British culture. Fraternal orders of Druids were founded in the 18th century. Robes were designed. Ceremonies were invented. By the 20th century, groups were holding solstice rituals at the stones, and press photographs of white-robed figures at sunrise had fixed the association permanently in the public mind. None of it has any connection to the builders. The chronology is not close. Stonehenge was completed around 2500 BC and abandoned by about 1600 BC. The Druids are described by Greek and Roman writers in the last centuries BC. some 1,500 years after the last work on the monument, and further from it in time than we are from the Norman conquest. The distance is worth restating because people rarely feel it. If you stood at Stonehenge on the day the last stone was raised, the Druids were as far in your future as you are in ours. The gap between the builders and the Druids is larger than the gap between the Druids and us. It is worth being fair about this. Aubrey and Stukeley were not fools. They were working before radiocarbon dating, before stratigraphic excavation, and before anybody understood that British prehistory was thousands of years deep rather than hundreds. Given their tools, the Druid theory was a reasonable guess. It has simply been wrong for 200 years and refuses to die. It has survived because it is a good story and because it filled a vacuum. In the absence of any known name for the builders, the Druids offered one, and a name is very hard to dislodge once it has attached itself to a famous thing. And there is no harm in modern Druids gathering at the stones, who are generally clear that theirs is a revived tradition rather than an inherited one. The harm is only to the builders, whose actual achievement gets handed to somebody else. The people who moved the Bluestones deserve the credit, and we do not even know what language they spoke. The 18th and 19th centuries dug at Stonehenge with enthusiasm and almost no method. The dominant figure is Sir Richard Colt-Hoare, a wealthy Wiltshire landowner who, with a professional excavator named William Cunnington, opened several hundred burial mounds across the plain between about 1800 and 1810, sometimes several in a day. They found extraordinary things. The Bush Barrow Burial, a mile from Stonehenge, contained a man laid out with a bronze dagger whose handle was inlaid with thousands of tiny gold pins, a stone mace, and a lozenge of sheet gold worked with fine geometric lines. It remains one of the richest Bronze Age graves ever found in Britain. The lozenge in particular is an extraordinary object, worked with a precision that specialists have since shown involves setting out angles accurately enough to suggest real geometric knowledge. It was found lying on the man's chest, where it had presumably been fastened to his clothing. But the recording was minimal by any modern standard, the stratigraphy was destroyed as they went, and much of what was found cannot now be tied to a specific context. Colt-Hoare's own summary of his life's work is a famous and rather melancholy line about how much they had dug and how little they could conclude from it. The line is, "We speak from facts, not theory." It was meant as a statement of scholarly caution, and it reads now as something closer to an admission. They had opened hundreds of graves and could say almost nothing about the people in them. Meanwhile, the monument itself was falling apart. A trilithon collapsed in a storm on the last day of 1900, bringing down an upright and its lintel. Stones leaned at alarming angles. Visitors arrived in growing numbers by rail and carriage, climbed on the stones, picnicked among them, and chipped off souvenirs with hammers that were hired out at the site. Photographs from the period are startling to modern eyes. Visitors sit on the fallen lintels eating sandwiches, lean ladders against the uprights, and pose in groups on top of the stones. There was no fence, no warden, and no restriction of any kind. And it was private property. Stonehenge stood on the Amesbury estate and belonged to whoever owned that land. In 1915, the estate was broken up and sold at auction, and Lot 15, the stones and about 30 acres of downland around them, went under the hammer at a sale room in Salisbury. It was bought by a local man named Cecil Chubb for £6,600. The story, which Chubb himself told, is that he had gone to the auction to buy dining chairs and bought Stonehenge more or less on impulse, partly because he thought a Wiltshire man ought to own it rather than see it leave the county. The auction catalogue described it in the flat language of any property sale, listing the lot alongside farms and cottages. It sold in a few minutes. Chubb was a barrister and businessman from the village of Thirty-tonne, a few miles away, and he had been born within sight of the plain. 3 years later, he gave it to the nation with conditions that the public should always have access and that the admission charge should never exceed a shilling. He was made a baronet for it. Since 1918, Stonehenge has been in public ownership, and it is one of the odder facts about the world's most famous prehistoric monument that 100 years ago somebody could simply buy it. The 20th century then brought the excavations that produced most of what we know, and also the mistakes that we are still living with. William Hawley dug roughly half the site between 1919 and 1926, largely alone, underfunded, and increasingly demoralized. His records are patchy, and his reburial of the cremated bone was a serious loss. Hawley worked through the winters, often with a single laborer, in a period when archaeology had almost no funding and very little professional standing. He wrote later that he wished he had not started. It is difficult to read his letters without sympathy. Later work by Richard Atkinson, Stuart Piggott, and John Stone in the 1950s and 1960s recovered a great deal, including the first radiocarbon dates and the discovery of the axe carvings. But large parts of that work went unpublished for decades, and the full report on the 20th century excavations only appeared in the 21st. Atkinson in particular became the public face of Stonehenge for a generation, writing the standard popular book on the subject, and it was his failure to publish the excavation record that caused the most lasting damage. The full account had to be reconstructed by other people from his notes decades later. Since then, the digging has become far more careful and far more limited. The major projects of the last 20 years, the Riverside Project, the Hidden Landscape Survey, have focused on the wider landscape rather than the monument, and have relied heavily on geophysics rather than the spade. We have learned more about Stonehenge in that period than in the previous 3 centuries, largely by not digging it. The Hidden Landscapes Project used ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry to survey several square kilometers around the monument without breaking the turf, and found dozens of previously unknown features. It is now possible to map a buried landscape in detail and leave it entirely undisturbed for future methods. Here is the part of the story that surprises almost everybody, and it is not a secret or a conspiracy. It is simply not mentioned on the postcards. A significant proportion of what you see at Stonehenge today was put there in the 20th century by engineers with cranes and concrete. It began after the collapse of 1900. In 1901, a leaning upright of the outer circle, stone 56, was straightened and set in concrete under the supervision of the architect and archaeologist involved. It was the first modern intervention, and it was carried out carefully by the standards of the day and recorded reasonably well. The work was accompanied by the first properly recorded excavation at the site, and by the erection of a fence and the introduction of an admission charge, which caused considerable public annoyance at the time. It was the beginning of Stonehenge as a managed site rather than an open field. Far more happened in 1919 and 1920, when 6 stones were straightened and set in concrete during Hawley's excavations. Then in 1958, the trilithon that had fallen in 1797 was re-erected, along with the one that fell in 1900. Cranes lifted stones weighing over 30 tons back into position, and their bases were fixed in concrete. Photographs of the 1958 operation are worth seeing. A mobile crane stands beside the trilithon with the great stone slung beneath it, and men in flat caps steady it by hand as it swings into position, roughly 4,500 years after the last time anyone did that. It was during that 1958 work that engineers drilled cores through cracked uprights to insert metal ties, the cores that would, 60 years later, finally identify West Woods as the Sarsens source. The most important scientific result of the whole restoration program came from a repair. The final campaign ran from 1959 to 1964, when 4 more stones were straightened and concreted. In total, around half the standing stones at Stonehenge have been moved, straightened or reset by modern hands, and many of them stand in concrete collars beneath the turf. The figure is often quoted loosely, so it is worth being precise about it. Of the stones standing today, a substantial number have been straightened, reset, or stabilized, and the interventions are documented site by site in the published record. None of them involved bringing in stone from elsewhere. This produced a certain amount of public unhappiness when it became widely known in the 1980s, and some of the coverage was overheated. Nobody had invented the monument. The stones are the original stones, and in most cases they were put back into their own sockets, at angles reconstructed from photographs and survey records. Where the evidence for the original angle was uncertain, the engineers used the surviving socket and the position of the stone's own base as the guide, on the reasonable principle that a stone falls out of its hole in a predictable direction and can be levered back the same way. The serious criticism is different, and archaeologists make it themselves. The work was done at a time when the ground beneath and around the stones was regarded as an engineering problem rather than an archaeological archive. Sockets were emptied and refilled, deposits were disturbed, and the records of what was found are not good enough. Information was lost that cannot be recovered. That is the real cost, and it is permanent. Every deposit that was cleared out to pour a concrete collar was a sequence of layers that could have been dated, sampled, and analyzed with techniques that had not been invented yet. We traded information for stability without knowing the price. There is also an honest philosophical question underneath it, which applies to every ancient monument in the world. Should a ruin be allowed to fall? The stones were genuinely unstable, and without intervention several more would have come down during the 20th century. Doing nothing was also a choice with permanent consequences. Most heritage bodies now take the position that stabilization is acceptable and reconstruction is not, but the line between the two is much less clear in practice than in principle. Straightening a leaning stone is arguably both at once. What the restorations mean in practice is that the famous silhouette is a curated one. It is the monument as archaeologists of the 1950s believed it had stood, assembled from genuine ancient stone. It is not a fake, and it is not quite an untouched survival either. It is somewhere in between, like most old buildings. The site around it has been curated too. For decades, a main road ran within a few meters of the stones, and a shabby collection of buildings sat beside them. The road was closed in 2013 and grassed over, and the visitor center was moved 1.5 miles away, which has restored a great deal of the monument's setting. The old A344 ran so close that coaches passed within a few meters of the heel stone, which sat marooned on the far side of the tarmac from the monument it belongs to. Closing it reunited the heel stone with the circle for the first time in 2 centuries. Standing there now with the traffic gone, you get something closer to what the builders arranged. An open expanse of chalk downland, barrows on the skyline, the long shallow valley, and the stones sitting slightly below the highest ground, where they have been for 4,500 years. So let us be honest about the size of the gap, because it is the most interesting thing about Stonehenge and it tends to get smoothed over. After 400 years of investigation, we have a detailed answer to almost every question except the one everybody actually asks. We do not know what it was for. Not in the sense of lacking a theory, there are a great many theories, and several of them are good. Temple. A calendar. A place of healing. A monument to the ancestors. A neutral ground where a divided island came together. A cenotaph for the dead. All of these have been argued by serious people, and none can be demonstrated. It is also worth noticing that these theories are not necessarily rivals. A monument used for 1,500 years by several different societies almost certainly meant different things at different times, and the version that mattered in 3000 BC need not resemble the version that mattered in 2000 BC. We do not know what the builders believed. We have no myths, no names of gods, no words at all. Everything about their religion is inference from where they put things. That is a very thin basis for reconstructing what somebody thought was happening when they stood inside a circle of stone in the middle of winter. Compare that with somewhere like Egypt, where the beliefs are written on the walls in the words of the people who held them. At Stonehenge we have the building and nothing else at all, which is like being handed a cathedral by a civilization that left no books. We do not know why the Bluestones specifically. This is perhaps the sharpest question of all. Any stone would have stood upright. These are not beautiful, not unusually hard, not obviously special in any way we can detect. Something about that particular hillside in Wales mattered enough to justify 240 kilometers, and we cannot see what it was. Several answers have been proposed. that the stones were believed to heal, that they came from an ancestral homeland, that they were spoils or gifts or the physical proof of an alliance between distant communities. Each is plausible and none leaves any trace we could test. We do not know how the altar stone came from Scotland, or why, or whether it arrived with the others. That result is only a year or two old and the implications have not been absorbed yet. It stretches the geography of the monument from one end of Britain to the other. We do not know who was buried there, in the sense that matters. We know their strontium and their sex and their approximate ages, but cremation has removed everything else. There will never be DNA from the Stonehenge dead. They are the only major population of Neolithic Britain permanently beyond that kind of study. There is a genuine irony in that. The Neolithic dead of Britain are otherwise increasingly well understood, because unburnt bone from tombs across the country has yielded family trees and migration histories in astonishing detail. The one population we would most like to read is the one that was burned. We do not know what happened inside the circle. The architecture tells us it was enclosed, finished on the inner faces, entered from one direction, and acoustically self-contained. All of that describes a room and none of it describes what the room was used for. Every civilization that leaves a building leaves this problem behind it. Architecture records what people did carefully enough to build for, but it does not record what they said, sang, feared, or believed while they were inside it. We do not know why it stopped. We can list plausible pressures, population change, metal, climate, the rise of individual status, but we cannot say which of them mattered, or whether the reason was something we have not thought of at all. There is a particular difficulty with endings, which is that they leave much thinner evidence than beginnings. Building generates material. Ceasing to build generates nothing at all, and an absence is very hard to date. And we do not know how much of what we think we know will survive the next 50 years. In the past 2 decades alone, the source of the Sarsens has been identified, the builder's village has been found, a stone circle has been discovered at the end of the avenue, the Scottish origin of the altar stone has been established, and the population of Neolithic Britain has been shown to have been almost entirely replaced. Every one of those was a surprise. That is not a failure of archaeology. It is what a living question looks like. The monument is still producing answers, and each answer has so far made the central absence more conspicuous rather than less. We know more about Stonehenge every year, and we are no closer at all to knowing what it meant. If somebody had written this account 30 years ago, a third of what has been said tonight would have been unavailable, and some of it would have been stated the other way round. That is the honest position, and it is worth holding lightly. It is worth ending where the whole thing began, which is with people. Not with alignments or isotopes or radiocarbon dates, but with a group of human beings on a cold plain, doing something enormously difficult for a reason they never wrote down. Picture them arriving in midwinter, coming up from the river in the short afternoon. The ground is hard. There are fires burning on the slope at Dyington, and the smell of roasting pig, and hundreds of people who have walked for weeks to be there. Cattle driven from the far north stand in pens. Somewhere in the crowd are people who have never met before and never will again. There would be children running between the houses, dogs, smoke going straight up in cold air, and the ordinary noise of a great many people in one place. Most of what happened on those days was almost certainly not solemn at all. Picture the walk up the avenue in the last of the light, the white chalk banks on either side, the ground rising, and then the monument appearing above the skyline all at once. A solid pale ring of stone, unbroken, with a single dark doorway facing you. The chalk banks would have caught what light was left, two pale lines running ahead of you into the dusk, and everyone walking would have been walking the same way, at the same pace, toward the same thing. Picture going in through that door with the sun low behind you, into a room with no roof and walls 4.5 meters high, where the light comes down between the great trilithons and lands on the stones at the far end. And then the sun setting exactly in the gap they built for it, on the shortest afternoon of the year. Whatever you had come to do, you would have done it there, in a space that held perhaps a few dozen people, with the stone close on every side and the sky open overhead and the cold coming up out of the ground. We do not know what was said. We do not know whether anybody spoke at all. But we know that people came from every part of Britain to be there when it happened, and that they did this for centuries, and that they carried their dead across a country to be buried in that ground. That is not a small thing to be certain of. Across 4,500 years, with no writing and no shared language between them and us, the one message that has come through undamaged is that this mattered enormously to them. And then it faded. Not violently. The gatherings got smaller. The pits dug for new stones were never filled. A different people came with metal and different customs, and they left the stones alone and buried their own dead on the hills around, in sight of something they did not understand either. The last people to use it may not have known they were the last. Somebody walked away from those stones for the final time, on an ordinary afternoon, expecting to come back. 2,000 years of silence. Sheep on the plain. A Roman coin dropped in the grass. A Saxon word for the shape of a gallows. A wizard in a story. A man who bought it by accident at an auction and gave it away. Then antiquarians with measuring chains and clergymen with theories and photographers and a fence and a road, and finally a nation that decided the thing belonged to everybody and closed the road again. And tonight it is standing out there in the dark, in the rain most likely, on an empty stretch of chalk in southern England, with the road closed and the visitors gone home, and nothing moving on the plain at all. There is nobody there now. The car park is empty, the gates are locked, and the only movement on the plain is the weather going across it in the dark. The stones do not need us to explain them. They have outlasted every explanation offered so far. The Romans, the giants, the wizard, the Druids, the astronomers with their computers, and they will outlast ours as well, whatever it turns out to be. Each generation looks at those stones and finds its own reflection in them, and the stones take no notice whatsoever, which is probably the most honest relationship anybody has ever had with them. What they carry is simpler than any theory, and it survives the loss of everything else. Somebody decided this mattered. Enough people agreed with them to move 80 stones across a country. And they kept coming back in the coldest and darkest part of the year, for as long as anyone could remember why. In the end, that is the whole of it. Not a calendar, not a computer, not a temple to any god we can name. Just a great many people who agreed that something was worth doing, and did it. That much has come through 4,500 years of silence intact, and it needs no translation. It is the one part of Stonehenge that nobody has ever had to guess at. Everything else is inference. That part is simply the stones themselves, standing where they were put, still doing the only thing they were ever certainly built to do, which is to remain. So let the plain go quiet now. Let the stones stand in the dark where they have always stood, patient, with the frost coming down on them, waiting for a sunrise they were built to meet. The ground is hard out there tonight, and the grass is gray, and the barrows on the skyline are just shapes. Nothing is happening at all, and nothing needs to. Sleep well. The sun will come back. It always has.